For people that aren't from British Columbia, 2005 was kind of an interesting period in the history of the forest industry in British Columbia. We were seeing a huge upswing in the devastation of our forests by mountain pine beetles. And it really was, I think, a kind of pivotal year or time where we were all starting to understand that one of the most critically important natural resources in British Columbia, and indeed across Canada, was facing new, very significant challenges as a result of climate change. So I have spent much of the intervening years working on forestry issues, and I have been really blessed during that time to work with many people in the union movement, some of whom are on the call today, and working with many bright lights and devoted people in the environmental community and in rural resource communities that all shared a collective concern about the future of our forests. So I want to start off today by talking a little bit about the challenges facing the forest industry and about ways that I think we could be approaching things differently in a way that would, result in healthier forests, but also a healthier, more stable industry. And then I'm going to switch gears to talk about ongoing research that I've been doing and that the CCPA has been focused on, looking at the Site C project and situating that project in the context of the ongoing development of natural gas resources in the province. So I'm just going to share the screen here now and hopefully not have too many technical glitches, and I'll start a PowerPoint. And I'll try and go through these PowerPoints, the two PowerPoints, fairly quickly so that we have a bit of time for questions and answers at the end. So the first thing I would do is just encourage people, if they're not familiar with it, to go to the CCPA BC's webpage policy note, where a lot of writing that I do and my colleagues do appears, and which will give you a really good flavor for the kind of work that we do. I started off at the outset saying that I started work for the CCPA in 2005, and that was a particularly interesting time to start working on issues relating to the province's forest industry. I'm just going to start off by showing you a quick picture, which I'm going to circle back to at the end of this presentation. But this is a shot of construction workers working on a residence at the University of British Columbia, one of two towers that were put up in the last few years on that campus. And I just want you to stick with that image as I'm going through the presentation, because as I said, I'll circle back to it at the very end. One of the challenges that we face in our province, and I hazard to guess pretty much everywhere, is that we have a problem, and have had a problem for some time, in terms of the resource that the industry and the communities and that the environment relies on is being harvested at quite a clip. And unfortunately, we have to grapple with the reality that there's clear signs in British Columbia that our forests have been overcut. And we're seeing that pretty much across the board. I know some of the callers or participants today are from the Prince George area in the central northern interior of the province. And we're seeing very clear signals that the rate of logging up there has been too high, and that rates are going to have to fall considerably to bring things into some kind of sustainable plane. We also know very clearly that as a result of decades of logging activities, and in fact increased logging activities in response to things like the mountain pine beetle, that the cumulative effects of all that logging are having very, very significant impacts on other resources, namely water. 2 years ago, we had the second of two devastating floods, but by far the worst flood in the Grand Forks area. And it is looking increasingly clear that the severity of those events, which caused extensive damage to homes and properties and businesses, including forest industry businesses, related in some ways to the amount of logging that had taken place at higher elevations. I mentioned climate change at the outset. In 2 years back to back, we had record wildfire seasons in British Columbia, as we have had elsewhere across the country. And we saw the equivalent of 4 Prince Edward Islands of forest in size wiped out by very, very severe fires in the interior of the province. So clearly, big challenges facing the forest resource base. So one of the recommendations that our organization, in conjunction with labor unions and environmental organizations, has made is that we really do need to review logging rates, and we need to grapple with the messy reality that those rates are going to have to come down. I think a very key point with resource development everywhere is that there tends to be a pattern. The easiest to access resources typically are the resources that are harvested first. So in the case of forestry, the valley bottoms log first, then higher up the mountains. In the case of fishing industry, near-shore fisheries, followed by deep offshore fisheries. And what we're seeing as a result of logging in some cases is that, in many cases, is that because of that pattern, we're seeing logs having to be moved from further and further and further reaches into communities to sustain those communities. So again, in consultation with unions and with the environmental community and with First Nations and with rural community leaders, we have advocated that there needs to be a really quick evaluation of where logs are currently being cut and where they're going, so that communities and regions have a better understanding of what they're facing now and in the future. My research has tended to show that there is a need, a critical need, to start to empower communities and regions to be more active participants in how the natural resources around them, in this case forests, are managed. In British Columbia, it is the exception to the rule that communities are directly involved. But I would argue that where communities do have a more direct stake in what is happening with their forests, the better off those communities are going to be. We have historic examples in British Columbia of communities that have had direct control over at least a portion of the forest lands around them. The communities of Mission near Vancouver and Revelstoke are two good examples of that. Communities that actually have dedicated areas of land to manage, licenses that we call tree farm licenses. I would argue that the accumulated losses of forests justify a different approach and at least some reallocation of tenures away from corporate holders to community holders, to vest those communities with more power and to allow them to work with stakeholders to develop new relationships that might help them. We know across the province, but particularly in the interior of the province, that many communities are exceedingly concerned, both by natural disturbances like wildfires, but by trends in the forest industry. And I think the community of Quesnel stands out as an example. It's one of the most highly capitalized forest industry towns in Canada, and certainly the highest capitalized forest industry town in British Columbia. And people in that community, including the mayor, Bob Simpson, who was a former provincial MLA, is working, and they're working very closely with people in the industry, independent foresters, climate scientists, First Nations, to try and develop a new approach to how lands in their region are managed, with a very, very firm focus on trying to make forests more resilient in the face of climate change. It's no accident that this is happening in the Quesnel area, because the Quesnel area was the epicenter of some of the most devastating fires that I spoke about a few minutes ago. The other thing that is very clear, and we're seeing it reflected in commitments made by both the provincial government in British Columbia and the federal government, is that First Nations in the province and across the country need to be playing a more direct role and having a direct say in how resources in their traditional territories are managed. And this is one reason why our organization and others have advocated for a radical shift in how we allocate resources, with more attention paid to giving First Nations realistic opportunities to manage forests in their traditional territories through the allocation of areas of forest for their management, not small allotments of timber, which has typically been the case. And I would argue, and others have argued, that if this was done, if defined areas of land were turned over to First Nations, that would serve as a necessary and vitally important mechanism for First Nations entering into partnerships with forest companies and others to develop those lands in a way that the First Nations felt was respectful of their resources. Many people in my province do not know and don't appreciate that most of the logging that takes place on our forests is on Crown lands or publicly owned lands, and that the provincial government and governments across the country play a vital role in valuing the resources on those lands. When I first came to British Columbia and started reporting on the forest industry in 1986, the minimum charge that the provincial government charged companies that were logging trees on publicly owned lands was 25 cents a cubic meter. A cubic meter, for those of you who don't know, is about the equivalent of one telephone pole's worth of wood. That minimum stumpage rate has not changed since I came to British Columbia. And we know from recent statistics that I've looked at that fully a third, 1/3 of all the trees being logged on public lands are still generating the minimum stumpage charge of 25 cents. I argue, and others have argued, that by undervaluing our resources, we set up a situation that has a ripple effect throughout the commodity chain, and that it is vitally important that we look at finding a way to raise those minimum rates so that we are sending a signal to the industry that adding value to our publicly owned resources is critically important. And I'm gratified that I have been supported in those recommendations by some of the people on this call today. The other thing that's been very clear in British Columbia and across Canada, and indeed around the world, is that resources do tend to accumulate in fewer and fewer hands through the process of corporate concentration. My latest review on that level of concentration in British Columbia is that we've got 10 companies that control roughly 70% of everything that's logged in the province. And that in the interior of the province, that level of concentration is much, much higher. And I think, and others think, that there needs to be an expedited review of those levels of concentration and a decision made by the provincial government about whether or not that is an acceptable level or needs to be ratcheted down. Log exports, the exports of raw logs, is an issue that is of great importance and significance to many people in British Columbia, particularly people on the coast. Every time unprocessed logs leave our country, what in effect is happening is that we are exporting jobs. So this is a picture of a fully loaded log barge in Port Alberni. Interesting to note that Port Alberni was the site of some of the highest per capita income of any community in Canada. But what has happened over time is that we're seeing that level of wealth diminish rapidly, and that is a real cause for concern. Our organization has been able to work with labor unions and environmental organizations to advocate for an aggressive phase out of log exports in our province. Currently, 6 million cubic meters of raw logs leave our province every year. A conservative estimate on the foregone manufacturing jobs is that that would create 3,600 new jobs in British Columbia. I'm very happy and proud of the work that's been done in this area. Our organization, again with unions and environmental organizations, was able to expose earlier this year how 2 of the largest log exporters in British Columbia, under the cover of the COVID-19 crisis, were trying to get export rules relaxed so that the door would be more fully open to exports. We have fought that vigorously, and I think with some success in pushing back on the government, the federal government, agreeing to that company's request. Very important, I think, for all of us to note on this call that while logging jobs are important in the forest industry, the greatest bang for the buck by far is in manufacturing logs into finished products. And we in British Columbia and elsewhere in Canada need to do far more to add value to the resource that we have here. One of the ways that I think we can empower communities and we can empower regions is to get greater value for the logs that are being taken from our forests. And we know from previous examples that establishing regional log markets where communities themselves were able to benefit from logs being delivered directly to them before they were sorted and graded and then sold would add immeasurably to the benefits, local benefits from this resource. A very critically important thing that has happened in British Columbia is that we have seen a severing of the connection between licenses that the government awarded to companies, allowing them access to forests to log, and obligations on the part of those companies that they turn those logs into finished products in the communities in which they work. That provision was known as something called appurtenancy, but it's basically just a big word for saying that companies had an obligation after receiving access to the public's own wood to turn that wood into products in communities. And we believe very strongly, and unions and environmental organizations have supported us in this call, that there needs to be some return to that idea, that it shouldn't be a free ride for companies, that they shouldn't be allowed to simply move logs wherever they want, that they actually have some responsibility to produce products in the communities in which they work. Going back to the idea of the issue of log exports, we definitely need to be doing more in British Columbia and elsewhere in Canada to be adding value to our forest products here at home. The further up the value chain you go, the more jobs you create. If you cut a log into a dimensional piece of lumber and then recut that lumber to become something that can be used in furniture components, you're adding jobs every step of the way. And that's something we believe needs to happen more here in BC, particularly in light of the fact that there's going to be less to log in the future. So if there's going to be less to log in the future, then the way you offset the jobs that are lost is to be adding more value to those wood products here in the province. So I began this presentation by showing you that picture of the construction workers working on a residence at the University of British Columbia. This is a picture of that finished residence. That residence is 18 stories tall, and at the time it was constructed, was the largest wood building in British Columbia, using technology developed in British Columbia to essentially put up a building very rapidly with preset wood panels that had been made in British Columbia and assembled to make this tower. That's the kind of value added that we can do in the province, and it is just one example. There are many, many other examples, particularly in the pulp industry, where there are huge, huge opportunities to diversify away from just making wood pulp for paper to producing wood plastics, to producing equipment used in surgical gowns. Ongoing research right now at the University of British Columbia working on producing filters for N95 masks that instead of being made out of non-renewable plastics are made out of wood fiber. So that's the kind of thing that we need to be doing in the province. Obviously, we have immense challenges as far as our forest resource is concerned, but a policy framework in which we think about adding as much value as we can here at home is the direction that we need to go in. It's what's going to be good for our environment, and it's going to be what's good for working people. So I'm just going to switch now to my second presentation and hopefully get through that quickly so there's time for questions. I'm going to begin by saying that I know that this is going to be a bit of a thorny topic because there's a lot of people that are working at the Site C project. But for the last year at the CCPA, I have been focused on risks to existing hydro dams in the Peace River region in our province, and those risks extend to the Site C project, which is currently under construction. And I would argue that those risks pose risks to workers themselves, and I will explain that a little bit as I'm moving through this presentation. For those outside of the province that don't know, a third dam is currently under construction on the Peace River in northeast British Columbia. There are two dams immediately upstream. One dam is called the Peace Canyon Dam, and the most significant dam, which is the first dam on the system, is the WAC Bennett Dam. And I will just show the first picture, which is a shot of the face of this massive earth-filled dam, which was named after Premier WAC Bennett. And what you can see in this particular shot is the earthen wall of that dam and just a tiny, tiny portion of the massive reservoir held behind that dam, which is called the Williston Reservoir. And the Williston Reservoir's creation, without question, became a pivotal event in the history of British Columbia. And the power produced from that dam continues to be the single most important source for power in British Columbia. About a quarter of all the power in the province electrical power is drawn from the generating station at this dam. And indeed, building this dam essentially created the conditions for resource towns like Mackenzie to essentially be born by providing power that allowed for mills, pulp mills, and sawmills to be put in place in that community. So these are very, very important infrastructure projects in the province and continue to be. Now this is a shot about 1 year ago at the Site C construction site, which is about 80 kilometers or so downstream from the WAC Bennett Dam that I just showed you a moment ago. And I'll be returning to this site toward the end of the presentation, but I just want to give people a sense of the scale of what we're talking about here. And this particular view of the project has the viewer looking downriver, so generally looking east. So what you're seeing is the north side of the Peace River Valley at the construction site. And if you can see the cranes in the picture, kind of in the middle area, those cranes are working at the entryway to 2 tunnels that would divert the river around the construction site so that the main dam could be built. Now, I'm showing you this picture just to give you an understanding about the connections between the natural gas industry and the power projects on the Peace River. This is a shot of a gas processing plant called the Sunshine Plant, one of many plants that are now being electrified. So in other words, these plants used to run and be powered on their own supply of natural gas, but now, encouraged by government policy and public investments, these plants are being hooked up to new transmission lines. In this case, you can see transmission lines off to the right of the facility. That's part of a $400 million public investment to, or actually $600 million public investment to extend transmission lines from the Peace River to these power plants to power them with electricity instead of natural gas. Now, in order to produce gas, what is happening 99% of the time in British Columbia now is that wells are being drilled and then fracked. And fracking, as some of you may know, involves using tremendous amounts of water under extreme pressure to bust open rock below the subsurface, well below the subsurface, to open that rock up and release the gas that is trapped within. And it is that process that is resulting in significant problems and tensions at the Peace River and raising concerns within BC Hydro, the main public hydro provider, about the stability of some of its Peace River dams. I just want to give people an understanding about the scale of fracking operations. This is one of dozens and dozens of dams that were built illegally, in many cases, by the fracking industry. Companies went and erected big earthen dams to impound water that would then be used in the fracking process. So this is a picture that a friend of mine took of me a couple of years ago at one of these new reservoirs that have been created by the gas industry. And the signage that you see that is stepping down and ultimately disappearing into the water gives you a sense about the volume of water that is in play. So if this reservoir is completely filled, it's 240,000 cubic meters of impounded fresh water. And bear in mind that 2,500 cubic meters equals 1 Olympic swimming pool's worth of water. So this reservoir alone, one of dozens and dozens in Northeast BC, holds the equivalent of about 100 Olympic swimming pools worth of fresh water. That gives you a sense of the scale at which companies have to use water in order to bust open the rock underneath during their fracking operations. This is a picture of a man named Dave Unger and a view of the Peace River with the Peace Canyon Dam in the background. The Peace Canyon Dam is the dam immediately upstream, well, not immediately, about 80 kilometers upstream of the Site C site. And I'm showing you this picture because when Mr. Unger was working at the Peace Canyon Dam, he was among the first to feel earthquakes at the dam that were later linked to nearby fracking operations. operations. This shot here may look like a fairly innocuous facility, but it is a pumping station for wastewater from the fracking process, and it is only 4 kilometers away from the dam that Mr. Unger worked at and where he felt the earthquakes. And through Freedom of Information documents that the CCPA obtained, we now know without a doubt that this particular disposal facility was considered a direct threat to the Peace Canyon Dam. Earthquakes generated at disposal well activities, operations in the United States have been as strong as 5.7 magnitude. There was an event in Oklahoma of that magnitude that was felt in 17 surrounding US states. And again, internal documents from BC Hydro show that a magnitude 5 event could have significant implications for the Peace Canyon Dam. So why should we be concerned about this? Well, here are two schematics that, again, were obtained through a Freedom of Information request. On the left, you see the number of earthquakes that occurred in the region between 1985 and 2004. And on the right, you see a much larger number of earthquakes that have been recorded from 2004 to the present. The increase in earthquakes is clearly linked with increases in natural gas drilling and fracking. So why should we be concerned about this? Well, here is a picture just a few kilometers downstream of the Site C project. And what you see here is what was once a road, the only road leading into and out of the community of Old Fort, which is just downstream of the Site C project. This piece of road and a massive section of hillside above the road was wiped out in a landslide. The entire area that the Site C Dam is located in is prone to landslides. It has very, very fragile soil, shale soils, and it has been known to repeatedly slough off, sometimes spectacularly. The house in the background was knocked off its foundation by this particular landslide. Now I'm showing you this picture because this shows you a shot of a gas well pad that was fracked. In 2018, 63 Olympic swimming pools worth of water were pressure pumped underground at this site. Why is that important? Well, again, think about the water that's required to do it. In this case, this is a massive dugout very close to the fracking site. When the 63 Olympic swimming pools worth of water were pumped into the wells at that site, and then just a bit more went in after, it triggered a 4.5 magnitude earthquake that resulted in the immediate evacuation of workers from the Site C site because of the strong jolt that occurred at that construction project. Now here is a schematic showing the Site C site, which is at the epicenter of the smallest circle. All of the red that you see are fracking operations that have occurred to date in proximity to this dam project. The one thing that you need to understand is that this entire area is known to be geologically very unstable. Independent geoscientists have reported to the Provincial Oil and Gas Commission that only small increases in the pressure at which fracking companies push that water underground will cause pre-existing faults in the region to become critically stressed. And we know that when faults become critically stressed, earthquakes occur. This shot here shows you just how many earthquakes in the vicinity of Site C occurred in just 1 2-year period alone. That's 2017 to 2018. And if we take the magnitude of earthquakes down to the very lowest possible level, there were more than 10,000 earthquakes in proximity to Site C in 2017 and 2018 alone. One of those earthquakes was the one that occurred at the well site I showed you just a minute ago, which was 20 kilometers away from the Site C project, but resulted in such a strong jolt that it resulted in the immediate evacuation of workers from the site. So in closing, I just want to show you this last picture because things have changed dramatically at the Site C project in the intervening year. So we now have a situation where the river has been completely cut off. And to the left of this picture at the bottom, you can see the tunnels where the diverted water is going into. And that diversion now allows water to shoot out the other side, which will eventually, if all goes well, allow BC Hydro and its contractors to start building the dam. But we also know from Freedom of Information requests that I have done and others have done that there are huge, growing geotechnical problems at this site. And those geotechnical problems are going to require a massive amount of money to fix. $5 billion has been spent on this publicly funded project so far. Another $8 billion or more might be required to finish the project. Significant undisclosed geotechnical problems have emerged at this site, which, as I've just told you, is being bombarded with earthquake after earthquake. We know from FOI documents as well that workers at this site have been working under incredibly stressful situations, particularly digging the diversion tunnels and the drainage tunnels on this site. Workers have been exposed to dangerous levels of rock dust, potentially exposing themselves to debilitating lung issues down the road as a result of silicosis. We have had concrete falling off of the roofs of diversion and drainage tunnels at this site. And we now know that major pieces of the infrastructure at the project are moving. And a huge fix is going to be required to make it better. And I want to close by saying that in late July of this year, the government disclosed for the first time that these geotechnical problems existed at the site. And the premier at the time told the public that he was extremely disappointed at the news. We now are in the middle of a strange election campaign in the province in which no issue has any traction whatsoever, largely because of COVID. And this issue really is getting very, very little attention. But I think that there are significant implications for workers post-election because there is a decision that is looming about what they're going to do with this project. It is not out of the question to think that the government could, on the basis of new information that is brought before it by a former deputy minister who is investigating the project, that they might conclude that the costs of going ahead are too high and that something else must be done. So I said at the beginning that this is tough news because there are I think 1,600 people at present working at the project. But this is a project that has been mired in controversy from the get-go. It is occurring in an area where there's already known geotechnical instability, and in an area where the natural gas industry is only beginning, really, its fracking operations. So I'll leave it at that, and I'm happy to take any questions.
I did have one question from the group, Ben.
Yeah.
People were wondering if the slides would be shared with us. Like if you'd be willing to share your PowerPoint with CCU so I can share it with the attendees?
Absolutely, yeah.
Wonderful. Thanks. You could just email them to me or Kelly and we'll share it with the attendees today.
For sure.
I got one, Leanne. I'm not quick with on that chat thing. Ben, what's the difference between site A and B as far as stability? Because we haven't seen the issues that we're seeing on site C. Is that different geological area, or are they not facing the same problems?
It's a very good question, and I should have been, I covered off a lot of material, so I didn't really get at it, but the internal documents from BC Hydro that I obtained through FOI show that the BC Hydro has concerns about stability at Peace Canyon and concerns about possible seismic implications at WAC Bennett. The WAC Bennett Dam and the Peace Canyon dams, I think in order, the WAC Bennett Dam is on much more stable ground and it therefore was the first site and obvious site to situate a dam. Peace Canyon Dam is starting to move into more difficult and problematic shale rock, and it's very clear from the documents obtained through FOI that when that dam was being built, BC Hydro knew that there were problems, stability problems, potential stability problems at that site due to the weakness of the underlying shale rock. But you have to remember that where the Peace Canyon Dam was built compared to Site C, much narrower valley opening and a straight across the river structure. One of the things that, if anybody's interested in the Site C issue, I would encourage them to go to the policy note page and look at a piece that I did on the Site C site, because one of the very interesting things about the Site C structure is that it is an L-shaped dam, which is very, very unusual. It's very unusual to see a structure designed in an L shape for a dam. And the reason that that L shape came into being was precisely because of huge geotechnical challenges that BC Hydro and consultants for BC Hydro became aware of as early as the 1980s. And eventually a decision was made to essentially bend the dam into an L shape to try and get around those geotechnical problems. And unfortunately, what's occurred is they've inherited a whole bunch of problems as a result of moving to that dam design. So your question is a good one. As you move downriver, the options for building structures become far less favorable. And there were all kinds of concerns about Site C, the Site C location before the dam even was constructed, and other sites. I believe there was D and E were essentially rejected because they were too poor geologically to situate a dam on. So from the get-go, we've had a dam that's being put in a location where senior engineers for BC Hydro, senior engineers for Clone Crippen, senior engineers for SNC-Lavalin, the two companies now doing major contract work for BC Hydro, were all flagging concerns going back to the 1980s with that particular site. So they knew going in that the challenges of building there were going to be great.
Thanks, Ben.
Yeah.
One further follow-up on that. Do we know the magnitude of work or any of the work that will be needed to be done to fix the issues they're facing there?
It's a very good question. We don't know exactly, and this is one of the things that I think is most troubling about this project. This is the largest publicly funded infrastructure project in British Columbia's history. Dams that have been built across the country, including most recently the Muskrat Falls Dam in Newfoundland, Labrador, and the Kiask Dam in Manitoba. They all go over budget. Almost 300 projects looked at worldwide by an academic who reported to a public inquiry at the Muskrat Falls project found that the cost overruns on average were 96%. So there's a doubling of the costs. In the case of Site C, we know that geotechnical problems have emerged. We know that the problems are serious. This is all based on what BC Hydro has filed with the Utilities Commission, but we don't know exactly what those problems are. They appear to relate to significant movement of the massive concrete buttress structure that has been put on the right bank of the river. You've got 1.7 million cubic meters of roller compacted concrete now in place, and there are foundational problems with that massive structure that are going to require, in BC Hydro's words, enhancements. So somehow the foundation underneath a massive structure that is already in place has to be enhanced to make it safe. We don't know what the enhancements are. We don't know what the specific problems are, but we do know that movement of the structure is involved. And we do know from the FOI record that engineers were well aware that there would be movement as they started to build this structure.
Okay, thank you, Gary and Ben. Dawn, you had a question.
I just wanted to thank you very much. I thought that was an amazing presentation. I'm terrified by all the seismic activity, but so I just have I have a comment and a question. First, I just wanted to say that I absolutely think it's vital that Indigenous peoples have stewardship over the land. It's amazing. I think the consultation process is long overdue. Obviously applaud the efforts to collaborate, but again, long overdue and definitely something that needs to be continued. And this is a question, I don't know if you can answer this. This is just something I've been wondering about and I'm curious. 2015, there was a huge issue with Japanese knotwood impacting the logging industry because of it was preventing species from growing, but that was many years ago, and I haven't read anything, I haven't found any other information, and I'm just wondering if you know anything about that.
I have to say I don't. I'm sorry.
It was a major story in 2015, how it was impacting bridges and it was impacting concrete. And then they were saying there was an impact to the forest industry and it was spreading like unbelievably. It was a hugely invasive species.
Well, I mean, all I can say generally is that introduction of invasive species is almost always problematic, and in the globalized world we live in, we're constantly dealing with the fallout of introduced species that are either coming to us or we're sending elsewhere. So it just complicates matters, even further. But I'm not up to speed on that particular introduction.
Thank you.
Okay. Thanks. Rod, you had a question.
Yeah, hi there. Thanks, Ben. That was a really good presentation that you put on today. Just a couple of things I just want to make some comments to, and it had regards to the raw log shipping and the the large forest companies that were trying to get the raw log export bill suspended during COVID. And they tried to use COVID as their main excuse. And largely because their forest operations, they had shut down and were using this COVID as an excuse, but they shut down before COVID even started here in BC.
That's absolutely true. Sorry to interrupt.
No, that's right. And they also approached myself as president of Local 8 and in the same city that they're located, and as well as Gary, our national president for the PPWC, to join them and sign a documented letter that they had labor on board to support this process to make this happen, which we flatly refused. They got United Steelworkers and also Longshoremen Union to join that, and we're pushing for that to happen. And we just couldn't believe, and goes totally against everything we believe in our union and as workers when forestry feeds our families, to join something like that. Funny how it worked out though, that as soon as they were flatly turned down by the federal government, they miraculously started their forestry operations within 1 week. So it made it pretty interesting that how COVID couldn't let them start up. But all it was about was just trying to ship more logs out of our province and out of our country. The other one is I just got back from Vancouver this morning. As I came into Nanaimo Harbor, there's two of those ships that you just posted up, the one in Port Alberni, sitting side by side, loading logs that are ready to head out of our country. It's a sad state of affairs when we're shipping that much wood out, when lumber prices are pretty much at an all-time high right now for manufacturing. So it just kind of sucks to see that kind of stuff going on. So just wanted to give you a little bit of some point of view and updates on that kind of stuff. But Site C dam stuff, yeah, it's definitely a major problem in our province right now, and they're trying to get through and figure out where it is. And we do have lots of affiliate members working up there, and it's a tough go right now. So, but thanks again for your presentation.
Thank you, and I I appreciate you amplifying on the mosaic issue. I didn't feel I had time to go into it in great detail, but you know, I was not alone in feeling quite distressed at the use of the pandemic as a kind of excuse for trying to get this significant change shoehorned in. And I'm gratified that I think the work that we did together collaboratively helped to push that thing off the table. You know, it is, I think, an indication of what can happen when we do work together and find common cause with one another. And I should very quickly add that, you know, one of the most distressing things about the export situation is that it is occurring against a backdrop in which a small, relatively speaking, independent sawmilling company has actually done what should be done and invested in building new milling infrastructure. And for the first time in 20 years, we have investments being made in a coastal mill in Port Alberni that will process wood that otherwise would be getting loaded into the holds of those ships and exported overseas. It's a sign of the things that can be done if we figure out, we meaning government, figure out ways to encourage domestic manufacturing and investment. We have logs here that can be profitably turned into forest products in British Columbia, employing people at good wages. We don't have to be sending everything we've got overseas to be manufactured in China.
Yeah, I definitely do agree to that.
Thank you, Rod and Ben, for those comments. Scarlett, you had a question.
I did. Yep. Just quickly, Ben, thank you very much for your presentation. I know the whole fracking issue is a big, huge topic that we could probably spend hours on. Just wondering, that one slide that you had with the number of no, it wasn't that one. The fracking sites, so from I think 2017 to 2018, and all of them were kind of in the south. How come there's no fracking sites north of the Site C dam? I don't know the area at all. I'm from Ontario. There could be a big mountain there. I have no idea.
Well, that's an excellent question, actually. So the reason that so much of the concentration is in that area that you see is partly because we were just looking at that particular zone. However, it is the case that much of the fracking is concentrated south of the Peace River, but also to the north, but not too far north. And the reason for that is that until basically energy prices all went into the shitter, the companies were really, really hammering what's called the South Montney, so the area around the Peace River and south, because the deposits there have large volumes of what are called gas liquids, which is a bit of a misnomer, but it's liquid in the gas, and in particular something called condensate. Condensate is a highly sought after commodity in the tar sands because it is used as a diluent to take heavy oil and dilute it enough that it can be moved through pipelines. So It's a critical component in the movement of heavy oil, and there's a lot of it in the deposits that are more to the south. The other thing I should very quickly say is that one of the realities that we face in British Columbia and indeed everywhere in the world is that resource industries are always subject and will always be subject to boom and bust cycles, particularly if it's commodities that are being produced. And if you go back, and I was actually on the ground to witness this. If you go back 10 years ago to the remote north of British Columbia, to the what's called the Horn River Basin, outside of the community of Fort Nelson, it was an absolute gong show. And I was there, and to give you an idea about how crazy it was, I set out by road with members of the Fort Nelson First Nation to go to a gas plant that was being built by Encana Corporation, about 2.5 hours north of Fort Nelson. We had to turn back on a gravel road within about a dozen miles of the gas plant site because we ended up in a traffic jam in the middle of nowhere with a line of 18-wheel trucks for as far as the eye could see, lined bumper to bumper, trying to get into that gas plant site. Fast forward to today, there is no drilling, there is no fracking happening in the Horn River Basin, and that $500 million gas plant is sitting on the landscape, never having produced an ounce of gas. So things change very, very quickly, and they certainly change very quickly in the Horn River Basin. Some of the work that CCPA has done recently is to try and flag just how perilous the plight is of working people in the Fort Nelson area. Fort Nelson had at one point the northernmost and one of the largest and most efficient oriented strand board panel mills in North America. The mill was closed by Canfor. Then the fracking industry swept in and seemingly was the economic salvation for the region, and now it is gone. So we've tried to advocate for, at the very least, federal and provincial monies being directed to the Fort Nelson area to at least put local people to work rehabilitating many of these abandoned gas well sites as a kind of first step towards economic recovery. And we have also been advocating very strongly that the community deserves to have a large community-based forest license, which they now have, and that the economic revitalization of the area may actually ultimately revolve around kind of reinstituting forestry operations and milling operations in the region. So time will tell, but the boom and bust is a reality that we're always faced with anywhere where natural resources are being developed. And the reason that you're not seeing that kind of angry rash of earthquakes so much to the north of the Site C site is largely a function of markets having changed and there being less drilling and fracking activity up there.
Okay, thank you. We're going to take a couple more questions and then we'll have a break. So Brianne, you had a question next.
Yeah, it's a, I guess, fracking related question, not necessarily specifically about the Site C project, but more general. And it's with respect to the required fresh water supply for that activity. And I'm curious if you can speak more about where the water's coming from, how it's getting there. Are there implications in terms of contamination? I mean, I feel like we've long since been hearing from Maud Barlow and others around the sort of biggest issue, or what will become a huge global issue, is freshwater supply. And so it's really concerning to hear about the amount of water, and particularly if there's going to be contamination issues. So I'm just wondering if you can speak a bit more about that.
Well, it's a great question. Thank you very much. So the availability of water is a critically important issue in and of itself. So the Kiskatna area, which is the seismically active area, has also been subject in several years recently to drought advisories. Problems with there being a shortage of water due to drought. So, it's against that backdrop that you have a number of fracking companies. The CCBA 3 years ago, or 4 years ago, I documented the fact that roughly 70 dams had been built by the fracking industry without permits first being obtained. They had built dams. They were diverting water from water sources that they had not been given any license to divert water from. So that in and of itself is a huge concern. These companies did this. They have faced virtually no sanctions for doing what they did. In addition to what we now know is roughly 100 of these dams on private and public lands in Northeast BC, none of which were permitted. There are a massive number of what are called dugouts, which are essentially big holes in the ground that are either capturing water that is running off the surface of lands or that are impounding groundwater. Again, pits that were sunk without permits being obtained. So there is ongoing concern about what the implications are for freshwater supply. But then the other thing that people need to understand is that every time water is pumped underground, it returns to the surface. Much of it returns to the surface, contaminated with whatever it has come into contact with underground. I just returned from Northeast BC a week and a half ago, where I'm doing research for a new paper for the CCBA, looking at the contaminants in that water. We now know that a lot of the contamination in that water is actually radioactive. So there is radioactive waste accumulating in wastewater pits across Northeast British Columbia, and that water it poses immense challenges in terms of storing it, safely storing it, and disposing of it. There's really typically only one way to dispose of it, and that's to pump it deep underground. But if you drain these pits that this wastewater is in, you can end up, and I know from FOI documents has actually happened, you end up with a contaminated muck at the bottom of these ponds that has concentrated levels of radium and other radiological components in it. I was just at some storage pit sites near a family ranch outside of Chetwynd, and when you approach these storage sites, there actually are symbols with the International Radioactivity Warning Sign posted on them, and the acronym NORM, which stands for naturally occurring radioactive materials. So we know that the contaminated water can be highly toxic, and that great care must be taken with it to ensure that it doesn't leak and contaminate groundwater supplies.
Okay, great. So we're a little over time, but this is such a great Q&A session that I don't want to end it. So you might have a few email questions coming in after this as we have to end it. I'm going to just allow one more question from Mark, who wanted to ask a question. So Mark, you'll be our final question for the Q&A period, and then we'll go into our break. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Thanks again, Ben, for a great presentation. I'm a CMAL representative. We have hundreds of people working up at the Site C Dam. You're correct. There's been some major safety issues up there, and we've had to deal with them on an ongoing basis. But my question is a little bit more related to the causes of the shifting of this infrastructure up there, whether there's been any research into the effects of fracking versus the effects of the natural shale formations up there. And the reason I ask is it would seem a shame if a lot of the problems up there are related to the fracking. It would seem quite a shame to shut down a publicly owned hydroelectricity generation plant in favor of a bunch of privately owned fossil fuel generating facilities, right? I think there's a pretty clear difference there, both for the environment and in terms of public policy for us. So I'm just wondering if there's any difference, if there's been any research into, if they got rid of the fracking, whether the problems would be as significant up there for the construction of the dam?
Well, thank you very much for the question, and it is an excellent question. When we helped to bring to light the rising incidence of earthquakes, we argued and have continued to argue that there is a very strong case to be made for imposing an outright ban on fracking activities in zones around this critical infrastructure. That to date has not happened. BC Hydro will argue that it has an understanding and agreement with the Oil and Gas Commission that there will be some prohibitions on the issuance of new subsurface rights to companies that want to frack. But really, right now, the only obligation is that companies that have those subsurface rights have to notify if they want to frack within close proximity to the dams, and there's then discussion and negotiation that happens after. I believe that that's insufficient. I believe that there is a compelling case to be made for setting very firm exclusion zones for quite some distance from these facilities. And then for the government to be doing some kind of expedited study to determine whether or not fracking of any kind has a place in the region, given the known risks associated with earthquakes. If you go to a report that I did on the move to the L-shaped dam design, I quote a foremost international expert on rock mechanics and fracking, who says that without question, earthquakes could have a significant impact at the Site C site. So there is that issue. The other issue is that irrespective of those earthquakes, the characteristics of the region's fragile shale rock in and of themselves are problematic and have been known to be problematic for some time. BC Hydro understood that that risk exists before putting the facility in and starting the work. So there's two things that are going on. You've got a structure that's being built in a geologically unstable area that Hydro and others knew what to be the case a long time ago. And then you're compounding the risk by introducing earthquakes. BC Hydro will argue that these earthquakes do not pose a risk, but I'm telling you that documents that I've seen, including testimony before the joint panel that looked into the Site C project, it was clear that, and it's in the email records, that a magnitude 5 event at the Peace Canyon Dam could have significance for that facility. And I would argue that in a setting like Site C, where there's a great deal of known instability issues, you do not want to have earthquakes occurring. I'll close by saying that a science panel that reported to the provincial government 3 years ago, and that we at the CCPA, along with other organizations, were instrumental in getting appointed. The government came to power, the NDP government came to power saying that it would appoint a scientific panel. They didn't appoint one until we and others kicked up a big fuss about it. And what came out of that panel's report is that there are just a host of unknowns associated with earthquakes that are triggered by fracking. And one of the most disturbing unknowns is that nobody can predict how strong an earthquake might one day be triggered by fracking. And I think what makes it even more of a concern is that we know that with the 5.7 event that occurred in Oklahoma, which was one of the strongest induced earthquakes to date, that it wasn't the operation of one particular fluid pumping operation that caused that massive earthquake. It was the cumulative effect of years and years and years of pumping. So what that tells me is that not only do we face the risk of earthquakes being triggered by fracking operations at the time those operations are occurring, but that the stage could be being set for a significant earthquake down the road after the fracking companies have left as a result of all of that accumulated pumping over years and years or decades. So I think there's two things to tease out here. There's the ongoing issue of earthquake threat and what makes the most sense from a public policy perspective in terms of regulating that industry. And then there's the issue of the ongoing known geotechnical problems at the site associated with the weak shale rock. Those two things need to be addressed, I think, if you're going to be able to safely proceed with Site C.
Great. Thank you so much, Ben and Mark and everyone for your questions. Ben, thank you so much for your time today and presenting on both topics and sharing your knowledge and information with us. Kelly, do you have anything you would like to add before we go into break?
Yes, I do. Ben, thank you for this labor school. It was very informative. Thank you for all the work you do. Thank everyone for the questions you asked. Highly informative. We appreciate your service and the CCPA. We have a gift for you. We'll be sending it out to you, Ben. Thank you again. And if there is any questions, can everyone email you?
Yes, they can. And if I may just take a very quick minute, I just would like to say a huge thank you for this opportunity. And just underscore how important it is for me and how much it means to me to have had the support and interest of unions and working people in the work that I do. It really means a lot.